Good afternoon, and welcome to NAMI New Jersey's Multicultural Conversations webinar series. My name is Lisa Powell, and I am the Program Coordinator for Act Now and the Outreach Director in NAMI New Jersey. Today's topic is mental health and communities of color. We are honored to have our distinguished speaker, Gayle Parker Wright, joining us today. Gayle Parker Wright is a native New Yorker who was born and raised in Brooklyn. She is a licensed clinical social worker, psychotherapist in New York, and a licensed social worker in New Jersey. She graduated from Howard University with a bachelor's degree in social work and from Columbia University with a master's in social work. She has over 30 years of experience working with individuals and families in underserved communities. She has provided services to populations such as foster care, criminal justice, Division of Developmental Disabilities, mental health, substance abuse, case management, adolescence, juvenile justice, management, care, and geriatrics. She has worked in various settings such as residential corrections, clubhouse, respite, and private practice. She is a certified instructor for trauma-informed care, recovery coach certification, parenting skills, questions, persuade, and prefer, mental health first aid for adults and youth, and many evidence-based topics. Over the last 20 years, she has served in a leadership role, providing management oversight, student instruction, and supervision, training on a variety of topics, and motivational speaking. She is a consistent advocate for people underserved and families that need support and guidance. She believes in peer support and is a champion of international peer support model. She is also committed to exploring self-centered treatment to individuals with mental health and substance abuse orders. She mentors and models for many in the field of social work. She brings a wealth of experience, knowledge, and expertise to the field. She is the owner of GPW Empowerment, Education and Training Services, LLC. Please keep a lookout for Gayle's virtual workshop podcast titled Life According to MS.G. Once again, this is one word, Life According, number 2, Ms.Ge, as well as many other community projects. Gayle, we are grateful that you are here and we're looking forward to your presentation. I will now pass it on to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And thank you, NAMI, for having me. I'm so excited to be here. So let's get started. So today, I'm going to give you a high-level kind of overview of what is mental health. We're going to talk a little bit about ACEs. We're going to talk about some myths and facts as it relates to mental health. We're going to cover racism and mental health, some different types of racism as it relates to mental health. We'll go briefly over some stats. And then at the end, I'm going to give you some resources and referrals that you can utilize for personally, as well as share it with family and friends. Also, we'll have a brief question and answer moment. So mental health includes our emotional, our psychological, and our social well-being. It affects who we are, what we are, how we feel, how we think, even how we act. It also helps to determine how we handle stress, how we relate to others, the choices that we make. Mental health is important in every stage of our life, from our childhood, our adolescence, all the way through adulthood. And so over the course of your life, if you experience any mental health problems, your thinking, your mood, your behavior could be affected. And so there are many factors that contribute to mental health problems. And that could include biological factors, such as like genes or brain chemistry, life experiences, such as trauma or abuse, your family history of mental health problems, and ACEs. So I'm going to go a little bit over that. But before we do that, I want to kind of get an idea of who's in the audience, right? And I want to be able to connect with you. So we're going to do some polling. So I'm going to ask my wonderful assistant to share the first question. And I'm going to a few questions so I can get an idea of who's in our audience. So do you know someone that suffers from mental health issues? So I'm going to ask you to either vote yes or vote no, and then submit it. I'll give you a couple of minutes, like one actually. So do you know someone that suffers from mental health issues? And that can be someone who maybe they have it, but they're not yet seeing a practitioner or provider, or haven't been diagnosed. You may know, or because of your history or your experience or your readings, that this person suffers from mental health. So do you think, Rosalind, we can close it? Thank you. Wow. So we have an audience 100%. That is awesome. 100% know someone that suffers from mental health issues. And so that means that, you know what, you and I are in the right place. What's our next question, Rosalind? Are you interested in attending a training on mental health? So there's a lot of trainings and workshops that are offered and available. And so at the end, I'll give you some of that information. Particularly one is mental health first aid. And NAMI offers a wealth of support and resources. So, and Ms. Powell, Lisa, is going to speak to that a little later as well. So vote yes or no. All right, awesome. And so we will share that information with you a little later. Thank you. Our next question. Do mental health issues affect children? A lot of times people, you know, they say, well, no, it only affects, mental health is only in adults. So do mental health issues affect children? Yes or no? Okay, Rosalind. Thank you. So we got some really, really, you know, ear to the pulse people in our audience. So 100% said yes, absolutely. And our last question, our last polling question. Do you think mental health is affected by racism? Yes or no? Okay, Rosalind. Thank you. So a large number, you know, agreed that, you know, mental health is affected by racism. So that's enough with our poll question. So we got an idea, right? And which direction we going. So I'm hoping that you get some additional feedback with the answers and the questions that we just asked. So we have adverse childhood trauma, as better known as ACEs. And adverse childhood trauma, excuse me, I just, one of these things that bothers me, you know, when you're doing the virtual, it's okay. So adverse childhood experiences, or better known as ACEs, are potentially traumatic events that occurs in a childhood's experience. So that means from the ages of 0 to 17 years of age. So anyone, myself, you, anyone could be affected and be by ACEs. And these experiences could be violence, abuse, neglect, witnessing violence, abuse, or neglect, whether it be in the home or in the community, having a family member that is affected by mental health and or maybe succeeded with suicide or made the attempt. So also it includes very many of the aspects of a child's environment that can be undermined because of their sense of safety. So what do I mean by that? So if you live in maybe in an area that, you know, is underserved, or an area that is challenged by, you know, gun shops or crime, you know, that's ACEs. Or if you know, there's no stability, no bonding growing up in that area, you know, that's ACEs. And a lot of us may not ID with the fact that we are part of ACEs, but we are. And there's, if you go online, there's a test that you can take to kind of gauge where you're at with it. But we also want to take a look at substance use, misuse. And it's not so much you, the person that's using it, but persons in the household. Mental health problems throughout the history of the family, instability due to parental separations, divorce, household members, even being incarcerated and such. So ACEs are linked to a chronic health problems as well. Mental illness, substance use disorder, And a lot of times it rears its ugly little head in adulthood. So ACEs can also negatively impact our education, our job opportunities, but ACEs can be prevented and worked on. So I want to share with you a video. So I hope you can see my screen.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a pathogen chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview, Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC. And together, they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you know, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand better than we ever have before how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, It is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a multidisciplinary treatment team that works to reduce the dose of adversity and treat symptoms using best practices, including home visits, care coordination, mental health care, nutrition, holistic interventions, and yes, medication when necessary. But we also educate parents about the impact of ACEs and toxic stress the same way you would for covering electrical outlets or lead poisoning. And we tailor the care of our asthmatics and our diabetics in a way that recognizes that they may need more aggressive treatment given the changes to their hormonal and immune systems. So the other thing that happens when you understand this science is that you'll want to shout it from the rooftops, because this isn't just an issue for kids in Bayview. I figured the minute that everybody else heard about this, it would be routine screening, multidisciplinary treatment teams, and it would be a race to the most effective clinical treatment protocols. Yeah, that did not happen. And that was a huge learning for me. What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions. From tobacco to lead poisoning to HIV/AIDS, the United States actually has quite a strong track record with addressing public health problems. But replicating those successes with ACEs and toxic stress is going to take determination and commitment. And when I look at what our nation's response has been so far, I wonder, why haven't we taken this more seriously? You know, at first, I thought that we marginalized the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird, because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACEs study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. But then, the more I talk to folks, I'm beginning to think that maybe I had it completely backwards. If I were to ask, how many people in this room grew up with a family member who suffered from mental illness? I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. Fortunately, scientific advances and frankly, economic realities make that option less viable every day. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across a lifetime. Today, we are beginning to understand how to interrupt the progression from early adversity to disease and early death. And 30 years from now, the child who has a high ACE score and whose behavioral symptoms go unrecognized, whose asthma management is not connected, and who goes on to develop high blood pressure and early heart disease or cancer will be just as anomalous as a 6-month mortality from HIV/AIDS. People will look at that situation and say, what the heck happened there? This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement. Thank you.
So one of the things that we started out with was we were talking about, we did a little question. Where were you with, some myths and facts, and what was the knowledge base as it relates to your education on mental health? Okay. And so as we explained with ACEs, no one is immune from ACEs. ACEs is a test that it correlates your history from childhood to adulthood and how mental health can be affected by that. So with that being said, let's look at some myths and facts. So what is a myth? Mental health problems don't affect me. That's a myth, because mental health problems are actually very common. And in 2019, about 1 in 5 American adults experienced a mental health issue. 1 in 5 American adults experienced 1 in 10 young people experienced a period of a majority of depression. 1 in 25 Americans lived with a serious mental illness, such as schizophrenia, bipolar, or major depression. And suicide, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in the United States today. So it's a myth. Mental health problems don't affect me. That's not true. Children don't experience mental health problems. Well, everybody in the room said, we don't believe that. And you were right, because every young child, even young children, may show early warning signs of mental health concerns. These mental health problems are often clinically diagnosable, but can be a product of interaction, as I remember I discussed before, right? Biological, psychological, and social factors. And so half of all mental health disorders show first signs before a person even turns 14. And so 3/4 of mental health disorders begin before the age of 24. So unfortunately, less than 20% of children and adolescents with diagnosable mental health problems receive the treatment they need. So early mental health support can help a child before problems interfere and other developmental needs come into play. So even when a child is early middle school or first grade, second grade, it's really important that we get the school personnel, the school treatment teams involved, because at that point, we may not be able to diagnose a child, but we can begin to look at what their needs are. People with mental health problems are violent and unpredictable. Well, that's a myth. Yes, when we're in the moment, we think that that's the reality, but it's not true. The vast majority of people with mental health problems are no more likely to be violent than anyone else. Most people with mental health problems are not violent, and only 3 to 5% of violent acts can be attributed to individuals living with serious mental illness. So in fact, people with severe mental illnesses are over 10 times more likely to be victims of violent crimes than the general population. So that's something to take a look at. And I know we see a lot of things in the subway stations and in the streets, but those are very few compared to the masses. You probably know someone with a mental health problem and don't even realize it, because a lot of times people with mental health problems are hardly active and productive citizens of society. So people with mental health needs, even those who are managing their mental illness, cannot tolerate the stress of holding a job. That is so not true. Nowadays, many people with mental health problems are just productive as other employees and individuals in society. Employers who hire people with mental health problems report good attendance and punctuality, as well as motivation, good work, and they really stay on the job a lot longer than other individuals. We have a lot of certifications now, peer certifications, recovery coach certifications, and a lot of jobs really honor individuals that come with a balance of professional experiences and lived experiences. And so a lot of times, mental health problems receive effective treatment, these individuals. So they have lower medical costs, increased productivity, their absenteeism is lower, and it's decreased disability costs. So a lot of times, you know, that's a myth. So those individuals do not, they work just as well as mainstream individuals in the workforce. So when we start to think about mental health and racism, we really need to take a kind of look through a different lens. And so people of color and all of those who have been marginalized by those in power experience life differently from those who lived with devalued experiences. So what does that mean? So that means that there's experienced overt racism and bigotry are far too often in communities of color. So racism is a mental health issue because racism causes trauma. Let me say that again. Racism causes trauma, and trauma paints a direct line to mental illnesses, which needs to be taken seriously. So past trauma is prominently mentioned as the reason that people experience serious mental health conditions today, but it's obvious forms of racism and bigotry that are just the tip of the iceberg, which comes to racial trauma. So what is racial trauma? Everyday people of color experience far more racial trauma than not. So people who avoid people of color because of their ignorance in certain neighborhoods and fear, banks and credit companies who won't lend money due to to individuals in communities of color, and also individuals in communities of color experience higher rates of interest. Now, people say, well, wait a minute, that seems like it's financial, or that seems like it's in a neighborhood. But that can contribute to trauma, which contributes to mental health issues. That stress can lead to all types of mental health breakdowns and anxiety and stress. Mass incarcerations, school curriculums that don't contribute to the education or of shared history, and also racial profiling. So racism and mental health services. So a lot of people like to say, no, there's no racism in mental health services. I'm here to say and beg differ. I've been in the field for over 20 something years. So a lack of quality services in underserved neighborhoods is very much, it's a norm. The difficulty accessing services. When you don't have concrete quality services in your neighborhood, you have to travel. And some individuals don't have the ability to travel, don't have the money to travel, or the wherewithal or the know-how to travel. The misdiagnosis. One of the main misdiagnoses in a lot of communities of color is schizophrenia. And when treating Black and African-American clients, clinicians tend to overemphasize the prevalence of psychotic symptoms and overlook symptoms of major depression compared to when they are treating clients with other racial and ethnic backgrounds. So what does that mean? So that means that when a lot of individuals that are coming and we are diagnosing them and then we're working with them, we're not looking at trauma, unfortunately. We're not looking at history, unfortunately. We're not looking at the environments in which a lot of these individuals live. So we just deal with the disorder that is prevailing in front of us. And sometimes that's a disservice. The other piece is our biopic youth. Our youth with behavioral and mental health issue conditions in communities of color are more likely to be directed to juvenile justice systems or residential specialty care programs and institutions than our non-white or Latino X populations. And so this is serious, and this is something to take a look at, because once our youth become involved in the communities or the juvenile justice systems, it's a very harsh but reoccurring type of trauma. And again, this is something that, you know, that is very serious, prevailing, and happens on a day-to-day basis. And one of the other things that we have to really seriously take a look at is the disciplinary actions in our school system. You know, you have some kids that perpetrate the same behaviors in schools, and they're not disciplined that way. They're not suspended. They're giving time out. They're giving, you know, support services, whereas youth of color are not. So that's something to really take a look at. There are various types of racism. I'm not going to go into each and every one because you'll have access to this deck, but some of them are, you know, just knowing the types of racisms, knowing systematic and structural racism, interpersonal racism. And that's usually like a racism between individual people, when an individual or beliefs become so prevailing that towards you that you start to believe it yourself. Institutional racism. Well, I don't need to go into detail about that, right? It's unfortunate, but institutional racism occurs within and between institutions, discriminatory treatment, unfair policies, inequitable opportunities. And, you know, you'll be very surprised. It's a lot of organizations that have institutional racism. And this is something we need to begin to have conversation about. Again, reverse racism, oppression, racial trauma. And again, all of these different forms of racism have a lot to do with mental health. And a lot of you say, well, how can racism and mental health? Because if you're so stressed out, if you don't know how to deal with the racism in your community or the oppression in your community, you become depressed. If you don't know how to seek services, sometimes it's just a matter of having someone to talk to. Everyone could benefit from a therapist. I don't care who you are, what you are, everyone can benefit from a therapist or some type of support. Why? Because then you have the opportunity to have someone to talk to be able to, whether it's about your career, your family, and it's an unbiased situation. So when you look at the various racism, especially now in our communities, it's really important to gauge and bridge that gap and get the support that you need. So some quick stats. Although the rates of mental illness in BIPOC populations are sometimes comparable or slightly lower than rates in white population, in the Black communities often experience a disproportionately high burden of disability from mental health disorders. So what does that mean? That means a lot of times in our communities of color that individuals, they don't seek help. We just, a lot of times we just seek, you know, disability because we can't function. And a lot of times we can function. We're led to believe that we can. Black adults are 20% more likely to report serious psychological distress than white adults. Although the rates of depression are lower in Black people, 24.6%, and Hispanic, 19.6%, than in white, 34.7%, but depression in Blacks and Hispanics is likely to be more persistent. And so that means that we're not seeking out the help that we need. We're not seeking out the support services that we need. And so by the time we do seek out these services, it's so prevailing. It gets to a point like what you see in the communities where we say, oh my goodness, it's so out of control. Why don't they get help? Because sometimes we just don't know. Cultural incompetence is a very big part of mental health biases. And what does that mean? Sometimes in our mental health services or our healthcare systems, providers are likely contributes to underdiagnosing or misdiagnosing many people of color with mental illness. So the language differences between patients and providers, the stigma of mental illnesses in communities of color, and the cultural presentation of symptoms are somewhat barriers in our healthcare system. And so what does that mean? So that means that a lot of times, you know, we have to take cultural into consideration. You know, I know when I was growing up, we didn't talk about mental health. That wasn't a big deal. You know, it wasn't addressed. You know, if Auntie Annie came to the cookout and she behaved kind of differently, it was just, oh, that's just Auntie Annie. But nowadays we're talking about it. We're bridging the gap. We're giving resources and opening the door for communication. So one of the things that I want to do is really stress the importance of understanding that there are resources available. There are resources available. And so I took the liberty of sharing a lot of resources that are available, especially now with COVID and with everything that we're dealing with. Because of COVID, we have isolation, We have lack of socialization. We have homeschooling, which is a whole different dynamic now. We have the, those stressors. We have parents that are working from home. So, a lot of times what was happening is you have individuals that would go from back and forth. And a lot of people say, well, traveling to work or leaving and having to go to work, that's a lot of times that's respite for people. That gives people an opportunity to kind of exhale. And now we don't have that opportunity. We don't have those benefits. So one of the things that I wanted to make sure that I wanted to do was to, make sure I provided resources to you. And especially now, I know people are still suffering from COVID, still having some challenges with COVID, but there are a lot of resources that are available via telehealth, via telephonic, via text. And these services are available 24 hours, 7 days a week. And so you'll have someone to talk to. And the services vary for being able to talk about your isolation, being able to join groups online now, being able to develop different services online to support you and your family. So one of the things that we want to ensure before you get off the call, that you take advantage of some of these resources or share these resources. And as I shared with you, everyone needs support. Here are some additional resources. One of the things that I made sure I added here that I didn't speak to too much was because of COVID and the isolation with mental health, we have seen an increase in domestic violence. We have seen an increase in child abuse. We have seen an increase in substance use disorder. And so we want to make sure that we provide you with a sense of resources and support. Unfortunately, we could be here for hours talking about mental health and as it relates to the racism, but also the support systems that we need as it relates to COVID. So there's a lot of resources available, and we're just asking everyone to take advantage of it. We want to make sure we check in with our elderly. This is a really, really prevailing time where mental health is affecting a lot of our elderly families and friends and patients. So you want to make sure you're able to provide services and support to them as well. With that being said, we're going to have a question and answer component, and I'm going to turn it back over to Lisa Powell.
Okay. Yes, now we will be responding to the questions in the Q&A chat. So please type your questions in the Q&A. Thank you. Okay, yes, Gayle, we have a question for you.
Okay.
So how do we bring the conversation to the providers? Many of us are loved ones.
Okay, so that's an excellent question. So we can't know better, we can't do better until we know better. And so one of the things that you can do is if you think that your loved one, friends, or family are suffering from mental health or need support in mental health, what you can do is you can just ask that question. One of the wonderful things now that managed care companies are doing, as well as our primary care physicians and our medical providers, is that they are tasked with making sure that those resources are readily available to patients. So you can ask your PCP, do you have any information on mental health services? Or can you make any referrals for me for mental health services? You can also, one of the things that I'm very passionate about and that I think is really important is that you pay for a service. Your insurance pay for a service. We all have the right to the best services. If you went into a supermarket, if you went into a restaurant and the food wasn't good, you would complain, right? And you would say, hey, how about? And so it's the same thing with the services we receive medically and emotionally, behavioral health wise. We want to make sure that, we ask those questions. So if you feel like, you have a family member that's suffering from mental health services, but they're not getting the support they need, you need to ask questions. It's okay. Can you help? Can you refer me? Can you direct me?
Okay, Gayle, I have another question for you. How can we better support college students who are suspect might be struggling but do not seek services?
Oh, thank you so much for asking that question. A lot of the wonderful thing now is a lot of our colleges have services on site. You don't have to, and you don't even need coverage. They can go to their local, it's a counseling center, and they can reach out and receive services. Now, a lot of times young people don't want to do that because they don't feel like, no, it's not me, or the stigma that comes with mental health. So some of the things that I've been suggesting is that we do meet people where they're at. Put this information on Instagram, put this information on social media. You know, they can't put down their phones. So if we bridge the gap and meet them where they're at, offer online resources that are kind of light and not too heavy, but also as an educational tool. So if we meet them where they're at, they have no choice but to say, hey, and trust me, I do some work on the hotlines. They're getting it. Our teens are calling, our young people in colleges are calling, and they're saying, you know, I saw this flyer, or I was part of this group. So we need to meet them where they're at. We can do that by going to the campuses, having conversations with the campus personnel, with the college personnel, but also posting on instant on social media.
Okay. Gayle, I have another question for you. How do you recommend white therapists deal with the issues of stigma around seeking mental health treatment for the Black community?
Thank you so much for being transparent and asking that question. And so a lot of times right now, more than ever, there's a lot of cultural competency trainings that are going on. There's a lot of diversity and inclusion trainings that are going on. And so one of the things that I would recommend for my colleagues, my Caucasian sisters and brothers, is that education, is to take trainings and to ask questions, become culturally competent, and not just by what we hear or what we see. And sometimes, okay, I'm getting ready to say it, guys. Sometimes what we learn in schools, you know, is not always what we can practice with. So being able to reach out and support each other, and reach out to colleagues that don't look like you, don't look like your counterparts, and being able to say, how are you doing it? I have a lot of colleagues that don't look like me, and we have really transparent conversation. And it's been very helpful with them being able to support the clients in which they serve.
Okay, I have another question. Do you think that young Black children are being diagnosed with ADHD wrongly?
Oh boy, I know somebody had to try to get me, huh? All right, yes. Unfortunately, I'm not going to just go with that diagnosis. I'm just going to go with a high level overview and say, unfortunately, a lot of children in the communities of color are being diagnosed, misdiagnosed, or overdiagnosed. And so one of the things that I do a lot of parenting workshops and such. And so I educate my parents that have children with special needs. And one of the things I do is advocate for yourself, educate yourselves. You know, a lot of people may not have the technology or the wherewithal to go online, but you can ask questions. You don't have to just accept because the therapist or the doctor say that's what's going on with them. Ask them why. You know, can you give me some literature that supports that? And so to answer your question, yes. And we have to get better with going in and recognizing, educating our families. We can do that via going into, you know, and the parent, well, when my days it was called PTA, but I think now it's called homeschooling committees. But we can go and we can meet parents and do workshops and share with them information. A lot of times what we find more recently is we have a lot of parents who say, oh no, not my child. He's just a little hyper, he's okay. And we have a large number of children that are on the autism spectrum, and they go undiagnosed for years until they become young adults, even teens. So to answer your question, yes, yet there's a large number that are being misdiagnosed. There are a large number that are not being acknowledged properly. And so what we can do to kind of move away from that or bridge that gap is ask questions and to educate.
Okay, I have another question. How is or if the certified peer support specialist programs expanding in the Black community?
Wonderful questions. I'm really excited about these peer support programs. So the peer certifications are lived experience, individuals with lived experience. And it's given opportunities to individuals such as that to be able to bridge the gap. So what happens is, it's very prevalent. We go out into communities. I'm a trainer for peer certifications and recovery coaches. And we are pushing, we advertise, we are really pushing this for our communities within our churches, our community services, for individuals to come out. you can work. It's okay. And the wonderful thing is they get pretty decent salaries. And so in our communities, the peer certification is frowned upon because we don't know about it. And so a lot of times when we have these experiences, we just think that we need to live in our discomfort. And no, we don't. We can get the help we need. We can get these certifications, and we can be productive individuals that are working like everyone else. I really, really encourage peer certified programs because I think that it really allows for individuals who are suffering and the family members who are suffering to be able to really have face-to-face contact and speak to someone who's has those shared experiences.
Okay, great. I have a statement. It says, I am a professor and I teach future social workers. This is part of their training and curriculum to be more aware, to reflect on bias, to challenge norms that might that have marginalized target populations, etc. We have hope and we talk about self-care, resilience, and support. So that's a statement. Okay, I have another question for you. What are the benefits of using a therapist within your culture?
So I'm going to take a leap of faith because I'm not too clear on the question, but I'm going to answer from what I'm thinking the person is saying. Or asking. So I think one of the things that's beneficial for an individual to receive treatment, first of all, because the identification, again, the education and the cultural competency component of it, the understanding of it. A lot of times, individuals go and seek treatment because they don't feel that individuals who look like them are readily available. It really gives the sense of comfort and bridge the gap. So with individuals with, say, language barriers, being able to meet someone who, or be able to provide services to one in their native language is very helpful. And it bridges the comfort and it bridges the gap as it relates to, oh my goodness, they're not going to understand. They don't get me. They have preconceived biases or implicit and biases about who I am or what I am. So I think it's very advantageous for individuals to seek services from those that look like them. But is that the be all and end all? Absolutely not. There are a lot of good therapists who don't look like me. There are a lot of good therapists who bridge the gap, who are very educated in the field of study. And so I think that it's important for us to also recognize the clients or the that sit in front of us. And as a clinician, make that decision. Sometimes we can't. Sometimes it's more advantageous to say, let me defer or refer. So I'm hoping that kind of answered the question. I also wanted to elaborate on the professor who shared. Thank you very much. And I've been pushing and pushing and pushing a lot of professors and a lot of the schools to have this conversation because it's really important. I supervise a lot of interns from graduate schools, and a lot of times they say, I'm just going to become a therapist without boots on the ground, without being able to understand the communities in which we serve. So thank you, Professor, and I hope that you reach out to me so that we can have some additional dialogue.
Okay, Gayle. Let's see, we're going to try to get 2 more in. I have another question for you. The conversation of bias, racism, and trauma needs to be brought to providers and the educators of those providers on a micro level. How can we do this?
Thank you for asking. We can do this by you taking our information and inviting us in. We have what we call cultural competency training, and that talks about biases, cultural, that talks about implicit biases. It talks about diversity and inclusion. It talks about white privilege. It talks about a wealth of information, especially trauma-informed care. There's a specialized training for that as well. And we also are asking people to bring mental health first aid to the communities. That bridges and begins the conversation. So when we talk about mental health first aid, we talk about it's in the same realm so you can kind of get a clearer understanding. CPR. So when someone says, oh, you need to take that CPR class, everybody gets it, right? Oh, you know what, help save a life until help arrives. So mental health first aid is the same thing. help stabilize the person until help arrives. So we want to get that out there to the communities, get that out there to the providers. So it's a matter of just having this conversation. And, you know, a lot of providers are open to this. A lot of providers are saying, hey, come in, we need this. So we just need to be invited in.
Okay. Gayle, you have quite a few good questions here, and I would love to get through all of them.
I know.
Let's see. Okay, let's try to get, if we can, 3 more in, okay?
Okay, all right. And I'll try to be short.
Okay. Great presentation. I'm wondering if you have any statistical data that speaks to the impact of having culturally competent treatments supported by inclusive policies.
Go
ahead.
Yes, we do. And if you reach out to us, we can get that information to you. Yes.
Okay. Mental health is a very taboo subject in POC communities. How can we encourage these conversations while also being culturally sensitive?
Wow. Thank you for asking that. And I think by having workshops and trainings like this, having NAMI support us like they do, being able to bring mental health first aid to the community, being able to take it to our churches, being able to take it to our community centers, being able to take it to our local, CBOs, which is community-based organizations. And you know what? Being able to bring it to our houses. Because of now, we have a lot of virtual opportunities. So we can bring it to someone's living room. They don't even need to leave their house.
Okay, that includes our questions and answers. Okay. And Gayle, thank you so much for joining us and sharing with us the valuable information.
You're welcome. So I know while you're getting that together, Lisa, I know that we might have a lot of other questions in the chat. If you leave your email addresses, we'll definitely try to, get those answers back to you, honoring everyone's time. Lisa's going to close us out with some more information about NAMI. In the meantime, you can, my information is readily available, and you can reach out to me via email at gpwlcsw007@gmail.com. And again, any information, any questions, any trainings or workshops that you'd like to see done, please reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you, Gayle. Okay, before we close up the webinar, I would like to share with our participants our online resources and information from the NAMI New Jersey webpage. From the front page, please go to Get Involved and click on Become a Member. Okay, and on this page, it will explain to you on how you can become a member. Then click on, I will direct you back to the home page. And then if you could scroll over to the COVID-19 page, how to access NAMI New Jersey services. And as you scroll down, you will see our programs, which are all free. The NAMI New Jersey online support groups, local affiliates online support groups, multicultural online support groups, NAMI New Jersey signature presentation. And if you click on this button, this is where our webinars will be placed along with the slide presentation. So feel free to reach out to NAMI New Jersey for any support you might need. Thank you again for sharing this hour with us here today. As a reminder, it would be appreciated if you could complete the survey at the end of the webinar so that we can incorporate your feedback for future webinars. This concludes our webinar. Thank you all and have a great day.
And Lisa, I just want to add one thing. They can also, if they want to have the additional questions, they can add it to their surveys and we'll acknowledge that way. So if they also, when they fill out the surveys, they can ask their questions and we will follow up with them as well.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks a lot, Gayle.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.